Okay, so we looked at fossil fuels, but fossil fuels are not the be-all and end-all of climate policy, because there's also, in broad terms, land use. Okay, if we wipe out forests and plow up soil containing a lot of carbon, that is going to lead to massive emissions. Well, it does lead to massive emissions. And if we, what do you call it, if we keep a lot of cattle, which basically fart out methane, that also leads to massive emissions of carbon dioxide equivalents. Okay, the point there is that methane is a very powerful warming gas. And also, if we apply nitrogen fertilizers and so on, we get a lot of nitrous oxide emissions, another powerful greenhouse gas. Okay, so what would the social planner do about that? And this paper is more or less about that. I couldn't really find a paper that was as clean as the previous one, as being basically saying, look, this is what the planner would do. Typically these papers are written mainly by non-economists, or there's a few economists here on the author list, same as the previous paper. Well, no, sorry, the previous paper, they're kind of in between. So they don't set it up in the sort of standard welfare economics way, right? So what are these guys saying? Well, the first thing they say is, look, we need to cut emissions, we want 2-degree target, and they say, look, these natural solutions based on land use, conservation, restoration, land management, they have a lot of potential. And they basically look at solutions under constraints about food security and so on, and biodiversity. So they're not saying, let's convert all cropland to forest or something. They've got constraints in there, which are it's reasonable to suppose that the social planner would have something like this going on as well. Okay. And basically what they find is that in the short run, this can make a really big contribution to declines in emissions, about 1/3. Can be delivered at reasonable cost, like $100 per ton of carbon dioxide. If that's the sort of social planner's social cost of carbon, then about 1/3 of the required reductions would come from these natural solutions. That's the first thing they say. And then early on they make a point that, look, net emissions from this sector aren't that big, so how come it's so important? Well, the point is that the flows in this sector are massive. So you have a massive flow of carbon in to things like trees and so on, and plants, and you have a massive flow out from decaying trees, ploughed up soils, etc. So this is like 20 in, 22 out. So when you look at the difference and say, oh, there's only 2 petagrams, it's not that big. But if you could imagine cutting this or increasing this, if you think in those terms, you can have massive differences. That's the first point that they make. Okay, and then basically what I want to get out of this, apart from that, is like what actual actions do they say make the difference. We're not going to look at their methodology and so on, because it's really, it's not that central for this course. But what actions do they come up with? This grey one is reasonable cost ambitions. Okay, the white is like high cost. But these grey ones, this is like, we should be very likely would be what the planner would be doing with a kind of 2-degree target. That's kind of their argument. And a huge part of it is coming from reforestation or not deforestation. Okay, this is by far the biggest part that we should be doing. Reforesting felled or converted areas and not deforesting existing areas. Okay, so no big surprises there, I guess you could say. We should also manage the forests we've got in a slightly better way, thinking about how to retain more carbon in those forests. We can adjust the management. We can stop using wood fuel and manage fires. On agriculture and grasslands, all these are pretty tiny, well, not tiny perhaps, but small compared to the forestry. And even here, one of the biggest ones is actually planting trees as part of the agricultural landscape. Another big one is just managing nutrients in a better way. And this is very low cost, that's a dark one. Because look, throwing away nutrients is never really a good idea. Think of precision farming or whatever. Conservation agriculture. Biochar, that's an interesting one. I guess many of you have probably heard of that. The idea of making charcoal and burying it in the ground. They seem to reckon this is, it's not a big deal, but they seem to reckon it's a reasonable cost option. And then there's a few with regard to wetlands. You should avoid draining peat. When you drain peat wetlands, you get a lot of carbon dioxide. This is absolutely crazy, so this is a low-cost option. And this is highly relevant for Sweden, where we're draining peat and we're using peat in combined heat and power stations, which is absolutely crazy, I'm afraid. Of course, if you say, well, otherwise the peat would be going into the air as carbon dioxide anyway because we drained the marsh, well, fine, yeah, but what we should be doing is reflooding the marsh, not digging up the peat. Okay, so this is the planner's plan, okay, for reducing emissions from land use. And let me just check if there's anything else I wanted to say from this paper. Yep, there was one more thing, at least one more thing I wanted to say, which was this quite nice graph showing how they see this panning out, their planner's solution. Of course, they haven't analysed the fossil fuel side, they've only analysed this side of things. But they're basically saying, look, you can achieve a significant amount with these measures, but there are limits. You're going to kind of hit a limit. Okay. Once you've stopped deforestation and reforested the areas you want to reforest, that's kind of it. Then you can carry on managing those areas to keep pulling in a certain amount of carbon dioxide, but it's not going to be growing and growing. Yeah. In the same way, of course, once you've stopped burning fossil fuels, that's it as well, but it's going to take a lot longer to reach that limit, and the amount of abatement compared to business as usual is a lot bigger. So these are very important in the short to medium run, these measures, but they can't replace fossil fuel mitigation. Okay, no way. Okay, so that was the planner's solution with regard to land use. plant more forests, stop deforesting, manage agricultural resources better. But of course, this raises huge regulatory questions, which we'll turn to later. Because how are you going to achieve this? For instance, if you start taxing carbon, is that going to lead people to plant forests? How is that going to work? So we'll be finding out later on.